Good morning from Washington, D.C. Good afternoon and good evening to those of you who are joining us from Ukraine and around the world. My name is Sam Greene. I'm director of the Democratic Resilience Program here at CEPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis. On the 18th of May, 1944, exactly 79 years ago to the day, the Soviet regime began the deportation of some 200,000 Crimean Tatars to Central Asia and other remote parts of the USSR as part of a concerted and targeted campaign of ethnic cleansing and cultural genocide. This was only the latest in a series of attacks on the community perpetrated first by the Romanov Russian Empire and then by the Soviet Union, including anti-Tatar pogroms in the earliest years of Bolshevik rule. Today, that criminal tradition continues and reminds us that Ukrainians of all ethnicities, cultures, and faiths are targeted by Russia's illegal and brutal war against Ukraine. Some 120 Crimean Tatars are currently in Russian custody as internationally recognized political prisoners and prisoners of conscience. By far the majority of non-combatant Ukrainian citizens held by Russia today, and some have tragically already lost their lives under Russian custody. CEPA is honored to work with the Ukrainian embassy in Washington, both to commemorate this sad anniversary and to draw attention to the ongoing struggle of all Ukrainians for freedom, sovereignty, and basic human dignity. We are particularly honored to welcome today representatives from the Crimean Tatar community joining us at a difficult time and in difficult circumstances, and our Ukrainian Democracy Fellow here at CEPA, Elina Beketova, to moderate this conversation. To start, however, it is my distinct honor to welcome to CEPA Her Excellency Ambassador Oksana Markarova.
Thank you very much, Sam, and it's such an honor to be here with all of you on this very special day for us. 79th day since the tragic event, since the day that we now remember as the day for the victims of the Crimean Tatar people genocide. We have raised this morning the Crimean Tatar flag over the Embassy of Ukraine, as we do every year. Because this year, as all the years after 2014, it has a special meaning for us. Of course, you know, we remember the 200,000 people, many of them, almost half of them, who died after they have been deported from Crimea by the Soviet regime. But then in 2014, 70 years after that horrible crime, the Russian regime, the Russian Federation regime, just continued doing exactly the same by illegally annexing, occupying Crimea, and starting systemic prosecution of Crimean Tatars in our Ukrainian Crimea, that is now for many years under illegal occupation. We have seen everything that, of course, we see now everywhere in Ukraine, but we have seen all of that in Crimea since 2014. We have seen prosecution of the Crimean leaders. We have seen annihilation and shutting down of the independent media. We have seen discrimination on the basis of religion. We have seen the violation of the language rights, basic human rights, you know, all over Crimean Peninsula. The Kremlin illegally detained so many Crimean Tatars, more than 180 that we know of, specifically targeting the activists and journalists. Russia have carried out also unprecedented militarization of Crimea. We all remember our Crimea as, you know, a pearl, as we always said, in Ukraine, where people love to go during summers. And now it's a military base where the Russians specifically are putting only military assets and resources and, you know, terrorizing everyone in Crimea, but also everyone elsewhere from Crimea. In the last 449 days, we have spoken about Crimea, but also about whole Ukraine, because 449 days ago, Russia reinvaded Ukraine and started full-fledged war. And we have seen everywhere in Ukraine, again, what we have seen in Crimea, specifically targeting the cultural objects, specifically targeting our Ukrainian culture, and Crimean Tatars culture is an inseparable part of that. So more than 1,464 sites of cultural heritage has been, attacked and cultural infrastructure by Russia. More than 60 museums were destroyed or completely looted. The losses in the field of culture caused by this brutal, unprovoked, unjustified war of Russia against Ukraine has already reached almost $7 billion, but then some of these losses do not have the value that we can attach to them. They're invaluable to us. The Kremlin continues to destroy Ukraine's and Crimean Tatars' cultural landmarks. I mean, we can count many of the museums, many of the very important places or very important cultural heritage objects for us. We see in the news how regularly Russians are excavating, again, a lot of treasures in Crimea and transfer them to Russia. We have seen how building of so-called the Tavrida highway or all the infrastructural objects that Russia is building are specifically done to destroy a number of burials or other landmarks which are very important for Crimean Tatars and very important for us again. We have seen the Bakhchisarai Palace, which we all remember going to. I mean, I personally have very fond memories of going through the palace, but the so-called reconstruction that Russians decided to have is nothing but the destruction of a very important place in Crimea. And not to mention they're trying, whatever they are stealing from Crimea, they're trying even to put it on the international exhibitions. That's why it's so important for us not to allow that to happen. That's why these events like this one organized by SIPA, and by the way, thank you so much for SIPA for not only putting this event together, but also working with the embassy, working with Ukraine so closely on so many of these issues. It's very important to inform the global community why we should ban Russia from participating in any of these exchanges, why we should not tolerate or legitimize their presence in Crimea or their presence anywhere with the Crimean objects on hands. So we have no choice than to win this war. And winning this war today is very important for the commemoration of the horrible tragedy that happened on this day 79 years ago. Because the evil that is not punished always comes back. And the evil that was not punished for this horrible crime against Crimean Tatar people came back in 2014 and came back in 2022. We are very thankful to all of our international partners, and of course, as an ambassador to the US, I'm specifically, glad that not only US is helping and standing shoulder to shoulder with us in this phase of the war and helping us on so many fronts, but also that US has been standing with us in adopting the Crimean Declaration in 2018. Which was very important. And that declaration by the US reaffirmed the policy of refusal to recognize the Kremlin's claims to Crimea, which are the claims to the sovereignty, which is our sovereignty. This is our territorial integrity. This is the home for Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars, not for Russian Federation and its regime. I'm very much looking forward to this discussion, and I'm glad to see so many friends here and people who really have a lot to share. Elmira, Ablyalimova-Chiyhoz, Alim Aliyev, Katerina Busov, Maria Tomak, and of course, Elina Biketova, our excellent moderator of today's discussion. And I just want to close by my opening speech with the words of very famous Crimean Tatar poet, Ablyalimova-Chiyhoz, who talking about the Stalin and Putin's regime, put together words which I wouldn't be able to say, of course, better, so I will read him. Oh, how many of them had courageously fought for their freedom and felt dead for the sacred, that holy the right, to eternally clear the good name of our people and let everyone know we are not dead, we persist, we are alive. And I think this is true today about Crimean Tatars, and it's true today about all Ukrainians. And we will together not only strengthen the international coalition, but we will stay firm in Ukraine and all of us together will clearly show that Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars are alive, that Crimea is and always will be Ukraine. So thank you very much, and together we will win.
Thank you so much, the Ambassador. It's a great honor for all of us to be together with you today, and thank you for your opening remarks. We have a very distinguished and experienced panel today that I will be delighted to introduce just in a moment. First, though, taking an opportunity to thank for such a timely discussion hosted by the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA, and the Embassy of Ukraine to the United States. Today, we commemorate the victims of the mass deportation of the Crimean Tatars from their indigenous land on the Crimean Peninsula of Ukraine. Over 3 days, May 18, 20, 1944, about 200,000 Crimean Tatars were forcibly deported by the Soviet authorities. During and after the deportation, when the Crimean Tatars were forced to live abroad, almost half of them died due to harsh exile conditions. And 70 years later, Russian forces continued their crimes on the peninsula, illegally annexing Crimea and conducting aggressive actions that aim to persecute the indigenous people of Crimea and erase cultural heritage on the peninsula. To discuss the mass deportation and its legacy for the Crimean Tatar people, I'm delighted to be joined by an incredible lineup of 4 experts. Elmira Ablyalimova-Chiyhoz, the head of Crimean Institute for Strategic Studies. Alim Aliyev, Deputy Director of the Ukrainian Institute. Katerina Busol, Senior Lecturer, National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. Maria Tomak, the head of the Crimea Platform Department, Mission of the President of Ukraine in Crimea. I thank you so much for joining our today's discussion, and I suggest starting with brief remarks on your connection with Crimea and why the Crimean Tatars have been the target of Russian forces for centuries. Some of our experts have their very personal stories connected with Crimea and deportations. I suggest starting with Elmira and then going around the table. Elmira, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a privilege for me to participate in this discussion. And first, I'd like to thank the meeting planners for the invitation and this opportunity. Concerning your question, Alina, Crimea, for me, I'm Crimean Tatar, and Crimea for me is is more than just a gorgeous place surrounded by the sea. Crimea for me is the land where our ancestors lived. It is the place from where they were deported by Soviet regime in 1944. For us, Crimea is the land we long to return to with our hearts and souls, the place of our rise, our development, the place of our 300 years old statehood. We are tied to this land by spiritual bonds. That is not only about our motherland, it's something sacrum, a sacrum for us. Of course, I used to live in Crimea and I couldn't imagine my future life without it. I worked in Bakhchisarai Historical and Cultural Preserve, the biggest cultural institution in Crimea that included more than 180 monuments of history and culture. And when my husband was arrested in 2015 in January, my life has changed because I focused on the attention to survive my husband. And that is why since 2017, we have to leave Crimea. And now we have lived in Kyiv. That's my short story. and about the policy of Russian Federation toward the Crimean Tatar people. You know that culmination, it was the deportation in 1944 was as a culmination of this policy. And the names of this regime were changed from Grand Duchy of Moscow, then it was Russian Empire, then it was Soviet Union, and finally the Russian Federation. But its aggressive foreign policy remained intact and aimed at incorporation neighbors' land into the empire was exactly the same. And the official Russian policy towards the Crimean and a little bit later Ukrainian lands has gone through several stages, during which the pace, forms, methods, intensity, and effectiveness of this imperial colonial expansion were different, but the progress of this process was constantly maintained. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elmira, for sharing your story. And, definitely Crimea for all of us is a soul, and our soul is with Crimea. And, Alim, the same question goes to you. I know it's a very personal story for you too, if you can share it with us.
Thank you, Alina. It's a great pleasure to be with you. What's Crimea? Crimea, we say that Crimea in our blood, and Crimea is our, of course, motherland. And why this day is crucial for us, because it's day of history, not only our families, but it's a history of our motherland and all of Crimean Tatar people. The story of the last 3 generations of my family, typical for Crimean Tatars, it's one of forced migrations. And the consequences of Stalin's forced deportation were horrifying. Almost half of the population died. As a child, I often heard the word surgun from my grandma Niyar, and its meaning exile, which Crimean Tatar use for the tragic page in our story. Almost every Crimean Tatar family has such story. And I remember the story of my grandmother. But the real reason for this deportation, for me, it's that Crimean Tatars has very strong national identity, and Soviet regime, as all of totalitarian regimes trying to destroy the identity, just kill the people. And today we have the very similar on the nature situation. During the last 9 years, a lot of Crimean Tatars, as me, as Elmira, as another Crimean Tatars, enforced migration because of temporary Russian occupation. And in the basement of this occupation, it's a new colonization. We'll talk about it later, I think.
Thank you so much, Alim, for sharing your story. And of course, we will talk about very strong national identity, how to preserve it. And my question goes to Maria, because I know that you've been researching and focusing on human rights in Crimea particularly, and you were witnessing the annexation of Crimea, and you went there to help people. If you can share your experience with us too, and why the Crimean Tatar identity, as we are hearing, has been targeting so much and intensively.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for having me here and for hosting this important event. Indeed, I have, so to say, a citizen connection to Crimea. I'm not from Crimea, but I feel like I'm connected very much with lots of great people from Crimea, first of all, of Crimean Tatar origin. And indeed, I came there as an activist when the occupation started, and I was documenting, along with other people, this little green man, so-called, right, who started the occupation of Crimea, and then the first victims of that occupation. And I can clearly say, therefore, that the war has started in Crimea in 2014, and especially with the occupation of Crimea. And I think that that idea that Madam Ambassador emphasized, that actually this genocidal intention started also with Crimea. Of course, these were the seeds of all those massive crimes that we're witnessing now, but it started here, in particular with the kidnapping and killing of Reshat Ametov, a Crimean Tatar activist who went to the solo protest and was kidnapped and murdered brutally, as some of those people that we've seen on the streets of Bucha and Irpin. So that there's no difference basically between those crimes aside of the scales. And now, I mean, I think that I really love the idea that was expressed recently by great Crimean Tatar, our great Crimean Tatar singer, Jamala. She said that we should avoid the perception of Crimea only via prism of, you know, this vacation place and chebureki and all the stuff. Crimea has this very rich culture, which is related in the first place with the Crimean Tatar indigenous people, this indigenous culture. And now, as a representative of the state, of the mission of the President of Ukraine, I feel obliged to ensure the right of the Crimean Tatar people, especially when Crimea will be deoccupied. I think that's a great also challenge and a task for the Ukrainian state to start this work now, not only to heal the wounds, but to provide all the possibilities for the Crimean Tatar people to thrive and to develop their identity now, and of course, when Crimea will be deoccupied.
Surely. Well, I think that we all agree with it. And thank you for sharing your story. We will go deeply then into your expertise further. But right now, Katerina, over to you, because we know that you've been also researching in terms of legal aspects, the questions of the peninsula. If you can share your story with us and your connection with Crimea.
Thank you very much, Elena. It's always such a great pleasure to speak with my dear colleagues. And I'm from Kiev. I visited Crimea just as a child. But to me, Crimea is about the people, and it has been the utmost privilege of not just working with, but being guided by the Crimean Tatar people, because they are the first who, since the beginning of Russia's aggression in 2014, did raise the issues of identity. They did say that it's not just about the appropriation of property, it's not just about business, it is about memory wars, it is about heritage, and it is about identity. So the whole discussion about why Russia encroaches, why Russia wants to really provide its own narrative about Ukraine's past, present, and future, it started with the Crimean Tatars' explanation of how we should decipher this Russia's policy. And it's indeed just also a big tragedy to see how the patterns that we have noted, we as the Ukrainians, but also as the world community, that we have seen in Crimea, how we have failed to prevent them from extrapolating to the whole of Ukraine. But of course, now is just the time to act, and this is what we are doing. We are definitely seeing the patterns and we are acting upon them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And, you know, I will just share my story as I'm also from Crimea, born and raised there. And hopefully there will be a moment for all of us when we can come back and to our land that definitely, as Alim says, it's in our blood. You know that we are coming closely to the discussion that the Crimean Tatars, as we have heard, had to experience deportation not once in their lives. The first annexation of the Crimean Khanate by the Russian Empire in 1783, then the seizure of the peninsula by the Bolsheviks in 1918, deportation in 1944. After the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, a new wave of political, religious, and cultural persecutions began, as we all heard today, thousands of Crimean Tatars and citizens of Crimea who opposed Russian occupation had to leave their homes again and move to mainland Ukraine or have become subject to persecution or illegal mobilization. So I would like to turn my question to Maria Tomak, who has been focusing on human rights in Crimea for many years and now is the head of Crimea Platform Department at the mission of the President of Ukraine in Crimea. How has the situation deteriorated after the annexation of Crimea, then the full-scale Russia's invasion? What are the main violations of human rights on the peninsula that you are observing right now?
Thank you. Of course, I would like to say, of course, that at the level of the international community, mostly this issue of the violations of the rights of indigenous, in particular of the Crimean Tatar people after the beginning of the occupation of Crimea, was emphasized within the UNGA resolutions, right? And they were adopted starting from 2015. And I mean, honestly, it would take like the whole time of the event if I would like just listing those violations that are there. I think that it's important to say that they are boiled down effectively to, again, to this idea of colonization that Alim was referred to, right? So we can see that history repeats itself. And I think it's really important to put the current situation of the oppression of the identity of Crimean Tatar people and of Ukrainians into this historical context. And it's not just, you know, the exercise for the people who is dealing with some, you know, journalism or like analytics. I'm really glad, and I think it's very important that this was emphasized, this historical perspective, recently by Dunya Mijatovic, who is the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe, when she wrote her report about the violation of the rights of the Crimean Tatar indigenous people. She started her report from the 18th century. And I think it's really, really important because that's the moment, obviously, when this colonization has started. And let me just remind that at that point, there were 90% of Crimean Tatar people in Crimea. And now we came to the point when there is 13, at least before the beginning of the occupation, there was 13%. And it's like not bad, sorry for this wording, comparing to the moment after the deportation of Crimean Tatar. But sorry, going back to your question, I would like to say about some maybe a very significant facts. Political persecutions, of course, it's very obvious. And I would like to bring the figure. Currently, we have the information about 182 political prisoners, Crimean ones, I mean. They are either in Crimea or on the territory of Russian Federation, and 116 of them are Crimean Tatars. So 60% of them are Crimean Tatars. And all of the so-called terrorism cases, so cases where people are accused of terrorism, are against Crimean Tatars. And I think that's the trend, because back in 1944, a Soviet regime was trying to mark Crimean Tatars as traitors, right, as collaborators. Now Russia tries to mark Crimean Tatars as terrorists, trying to make like this toxic atmosphere around these people. If we're talking about the period of time after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, I'm sure that we can see also these trends of specifically targeting Crimean Tatar people when it comes precisely, for instance, to the mobilization, right? So we can see that representatives of Russian occupying authorities, they come specifically to the places of the compact living of Crimean Tatar people, and they give these summonses for the mobilization to Crimean Tatars. And I mean, of course, it is important to say about some particular figures, but in this case, unfortunately, we have no particular data, but we can only rely on our information from the field and also the information of the Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people. And by the way, about the Majlis, and I think it's really important, it's not something new because it happened back in 2015, but still it's important to remind that the self-governing body of the Crimean Tatar people, Majlis, is bound in Russian Federation, therefore in occupied Crimea, and it's marked, it's banned, and it's criminalized as so-called extremist organization. So here again, we can see this pattern of trying to mark Crimean Tatar people as sort of extremists and terrorists, etc. And the head of the Majlis of the Crimean Public and the leadership of the Majlis, it's currently in Kyiv. One of the leaders, sadly, Nariman Jalal, he is imprisoned now in Crimea, and he was sentenced to 17 years of imprisonment. This full-scale invasion, demobilization, caused the process, which is really sad again, because we can draw some parallels again with the deportation of 1944, because lots of Crimean Tatar people, they try to flee Crimea to avoid demobilization, and they end up again in the countries of Central Asia because of these document issues, that there are problems with documents, therefore they have to go to the Central Asia. And again, this is a dramatic parallel with 1944, as Crimean Tatars were deported there. And again, as for the colonization, it's important to emphasize that aside of the fact that Crimean Tatars had to massively flee Crimea starting from 2014 and now to the beginning of the full-scale invasion, in parallel, there's a process of bringing Russian citizens to Crimea in order to colonize it. So at least 500,000 people were brought like this, up to 800,000 people. Just to compare, please compare it to the figure of the general population of Crimea, which before the start of the occupation was around 2.3 million people. So it's almost half of that number was brought, of Russian citizens who were brought approximately there. And that's what we call the another colonization. And of course, I think that my colleagues would more focus maybe on things related to erasing the identity via destruction of the cultural heritage, language, and school education of Crimean Tatar people. Yes, I would probably stop here at the moment and can answer some other questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. Definitely what you're talking about, this idea of colonization, that history repeats itself. For many years, we have been observing this Russia's aggression aimed at the destruction of identity and cultural heritage of Crimean Tatars. And I want to ask Elmira Ablyalimova-Chiyhoz, who used to previously work as the deputy of the Bakhchisarai City and District Councils and the director of the Bakhchisarai Historical and Cultural Reserve. What is happening with the Han's Palace in Bakhchisarai, which continues to be destroyed through intentionally rebuilding works, allegedly, right? And what are other crimes against Crimean Tatar culture you are observing on the peninsula right now? Because you've been focusing on it, and your institute is involved in it, right? Can you share with us what is happening there?
Thank you, Elena, for this question. Indeed, the Russian Federation is continuing to modify the historical and cultural narrative of Crimean in way described by my colleagues Katerina Bolsal. They russify the past, present, and future of the peninsula as deeply as possible, and they use the Crimea-related cultural and historical heritage to justify the fact of occupation, creates new historical myths, decontextualize the cultural heritage of the peninsula, and creates a new cultural identification using the methods of forced acculturation. Really, our organization that I represent here, Crimean Institute for Strategic Studies, our groups of experts has been engaged in the documenting activities that have helped identify some groups of violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law in the sphere of cultural heritage protection. And we fixed 4 groups of violations. First, change of ownership of cultural property and cultural institution. For example, I can say that more than 150 8,000 Crimean museum items are included in the state catalog of Museum Fund of the Russian Federation. More than 8,000 monuments of history and culture of Crimea are included in the state register of objects of the cultural heritage of the Russian Federation. Second violation related with illicit exports and other removals of museum items from the territory of Crimea to the Russian Federation. And we were able to trace more than 700 museum items from Crimea that were presented in Russian from 2014 to 2020. Third violation related with illicit archaeological excavation. And we fixed more than 410 permission for archaeological excavation in the territory of Crimea from 2014 to 2021. And fourth violation is damage or destruction of objects of cultural heritage that led to losses of authenticity of these objects. And of course, the most prime example of this kind of violation is the so-called restoration works in the Bakhchisarai Han Palace. Unfortunately, Russia's destruction of the Han Palace in Bakhchisarai has reached tragic proportions, with monuments being stripped of its authenticity and turned into a shaddily renovated new build. An ancient building replaced by a new copy loses its values as a historical witness of the past, retaining only the value of visual illustration. It no longer exists as a monument of material culture. As you are aware, the Bakhchisarai Palace complex was placed on UNESCO's World Heritage Tentative List back in 2003. However, Ukraine hadn't yet managed to finish the following up work before Russia's invasion. Russia has probably caused such irreparable damage to the site as to end any likelihood of the World Heritage status. Why does Russia do this? The destruction of monuments is always carried out for an ideological purpose. The Crimean Tatar people, who do not recognize the illegal annexation and do not accept the Russian occupation, simply do not fit into Moscow's Crimea is Russia ideology. The answer to the question whom Crimea belongs to lie in our history, the authentic, not falsified history of Crimea and the Crimean Tatar people. And in our historical memory, the memory of the native people of the peninsula, and in our right to self-determination in the territory of Crimea. The true full answer to the question whom Crimea belongs to destroys all the myths that the Russian Federation is actively creating in the Crimean society. And of course, this destruction related with our authenticity, because the Bakhchisarai Han Palace carries huge symbolism for Crimean Tatars people, being the only preserved object of the 3.5 centuries of statehood, and undeniable proof of our origin and our development of the Crimean Tatar culture in the territory of Crimea. And that is why the safe of these monuments is important for us.
Thank you so much, and we will definitely talk about how to save these monuments. And it's a real tragedy about what you're just saying about this erasure, this deliberately erasure by Russian forces that is committed right now at this particular moment. And we are coming very close to the topic of accountability for violations of human rights, Maria told us about, and cultural heritage, Elmira just told. I want to turn to Katerina Busol, who is a Ukrainian lawyer specializing in international humanitarian law, transitional justice, and cultural heritage. Katerina is a senior lecturer at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, and also Katerina and Elmira contributed to a study of the threats to Ukraine's cultural heritage posed by Russia's aggression. So the question is the following: what does the law say? What is needed to prove that cultural heritage was damaged, ruined in the war by a particular side, by Russia. We are talking that it's a deliberate attempts to erase the Crimean Tatars or Ukrainian culture, and that it has indications of Russia's genocidal intent.
Thank you very much, Elena. Well, not going too deeply into the legal aspects, I will just point out that both Ukraine and Russia are parties to core international treaties that govern the conduct of hostilities and that govern the treatment, the protection of heritage during armed conflict. The main rule is as follows: the occupying power, which Russia is, may not conduct anything with respect to cultural heritage without agreeing with the state to whom the territory belongs, unless an emergency situation happens, unless this is necessary to preserve a particular cultural object in a situation of emergency, which did not happen in Crimea. So all the patterns of violations which we have seen, starting from the mass appropriation of property, which include the museum institutions, to unlawful transfers of Ukraine's cultural objects, paintings, for instance, from the Ivazovsky Museum in Feodosia for the exhibition in Moscow at the Tretyakov Gallery, the unsanctioned archaeological excavations, the destruction, essentially the destruction of the Crimean Tatar burial sites mentioned by Ambassador Markarova. All these actions have been taken by Russia unilaterally in breach of its obligations to consult Ukraine on whether or not such steps are needed. And indeed, throughout all these actions, a more thorough question as to not only what Russia is doing, but why it is doing it, to ask this question is important. And cultural erasure is unfortunately a response to it. Ukraine has alleged Russia's policy of cultural erasure with respect to both Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar cultural heritage in occupied peninsula since early on. Essentially, this argument was brought up before the International Court of Justice in the case which Ukraine brought against Russia concerning alleged racial discrimination in Crimea. And quite symbolically, in 2 weeks, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, will resume its hearings of this case. And hopefully, especially in light of the full-scale invasion, when we see how the violations which started in Crimea, how they have reverberated across Ukraine, hopefully we'll see more examination from the International Court of Justice on cultural issues as well. The only thing which I also wanted to point out in particular is intangible cultural heritage. These are the issues of education and language. Again, Maria has briefly mentioned them, but I would want to point out that as soon as Russia appeared on the peninsula, it was an encroachment on Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars as the bearers of culture, as the bearers of language, as the teachers, as the as journalists. So essentially, this chance to broadcast in Crimean Tatar, to provide independent journalistic analysis in Crimean Tatar language, let alone to teach it at schools, it has been encroached. It has become dangerous to do that. And that, of course, is also part of the heritage violations and the replacement of identity and the wider colonization of the peninsula, which Russia is pursuing. So apart from the apparent violations against heritage as, material property, we also see the encroachment of its intangible aspects, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katerina. Yeah, and with all of that, with all these examples about the crimes committed by Russian forces in Crimea affecting cultural heritage, people, the next question is how we can preserve the Crimean Tatar culture. And my question goes to Alim Aliyev, who is a deputy director of Ukrainian Institute. And since 2017, the promotion of Ukraine abroad has been overseen by this Ukrainian Institute. So, Alim, according to the UNESCO classification, the Crimean Tatar language belongs to the languages that are under serious threat. Where and how can Crimean Tatars learn the language now? And definitely, Katerina just told us about these intangible valuables, right?
Yeah, thank you, Elena, for your question. And before I'll answer to your question, I want to give this broader context about colonization, because more than 5,000 cases of human rights violations in Crimea, and it's of course the tip of iceberg, and with the beginning of the full-scale invasion, repression on the peninsula intensified significantly. Crimea after 2014 has become a role model for the occupation of the new territories in 2022 by Russia, from the creation of places of torture in basements, kidnapping journalists and activists, to attempts to hold so-called referendums. And this colonialism is about appropriation or destruction. There is no third. I'm talking about the memories, symbols, names, and peoples. We talked today on May 18. And when we talk about, for example, violations of the right of self-determination of Crimean indigenous Crimean Tatar people, who see themselves as an integral part of Ukraine. And when we talked about the ban of the Majlis of Crimean Tatar people, the representative body of the Crimean Tatars, and call it extremist organization, I want to also say it about building the pro-Russian parallel institutions. Instead of Majlis, Russian authorities created a fake Crimean Tatar pro-Russian political movement. Instead of the independent media, they established media with the pro-Russian propaganda in Crimean Tatar and Ukrainian languages. And Crimean Tatar and Ukrainians with very clear national identities have been viewed as a threat to Russia's security in Crimea by the peninsula occupying authorities, and destroy tangible and intangible cultural heritage that does not fit into Russian modern ideology. Elmira said about Hen Palace. And if we talk about, for example, Crimean Tatar language, which listed as one of the disappearing languages by UNESCO, that's why Crimean Tatars see its preservation as one of our key tasks these days, because only 3% of the pupils in Crimea studying Crimean Tatar language. And what the steps to stop the language from the disappearing? Parents create private initiatives for learning the language, as well as speak it at home with their children. It's the same situation I was in Soviet times, and my mom taught me about such situation with in her family, in her home. And one more, what we start to do in Kyiv, we establish a literature project, Crimean FIG, that promote Crimean Tatar language, promote Crimean Tatar literature, and a literature about Crimea school, and to to establish an intellectual platform to talk about Crimea. Today, Ukrainian authorities also adopted a strategy on Crimean Tatar language. And it's important for us because we need an infrastructure to language infrastructure from the universities to schools. It's important that Crimean Tatars learn their own language, but also Ukrainians can learn Crimean Tatar language. One more is about history, and history it's crucial because Russians trying to fabricate history, and Russia Federation talked about Crimean history from the first annexation by Catherine II, but Crimea has a rich history from the Hen Palace, from the ancient times, etc., etc., etc. That's why we in Ukraine Institute launched the academic online courses about Crimea and Crimean Tatars on a Udemy platform, and all of our participants can learn about history of Crimea by Crimean Tatar perspective. A lot of online courses are also established here in Ukrainian language, and it's important. And today also important to work with the young generation, to work with pupils, with the students, to talk about different pages of history, to talk about identity, about culture, about religion, yeah, because what trying Russian authorities also using Crimean Tatar religious identity, something that has always played an important role to us, against us by fabricating the image of Muslim terrorists and extremists. But these two articles Russia uses when persecutes many Crimean Tatar political prisoners. But it's the kingdom of crooked mirrors, which Russia is building on the peninsula, contradicts the Islamic tradition of the Crimean Tatars. Nonviolent resistance in the Soviet times and now is fundamental element of the struggle for our land. But today we have another situation. And one more, it's about militarization. We talked a lot about militarization, about weapon, about that today Crimea is a military zone from where Russia just sent missiles, launched missiles to other Ukrainian territories. But we also should talk about militarization of consciousness, because Russia created a lot of paramilitary organizations that glorify war and glorify Russian army. That's why today we talked with Crimean Tatar families, with Crimean Tatar parents, to talk about Crimean Tatar history, about our traditions, to preserve our traditions here. We support grassroots initiatives in mainland of Ukraine and also in Crimea, but it's also cultural initiatives or human rights initiatives who support families of political prisoners also. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alim. A lot of food for thought, and I think we'll follow up with many of the points that you have just raised in our third topic of discussion. We have just 5 minutes left, and what should the state international community respond to the protection of Crimean Tatar identity and cultural heritage? So that's the question, and I think 1.5 minutes for everyone. So Elmira, over to you.
Thank you, Lina. Really, today, Ukraine is becoming a training zone for improving, revising, adapting, testing standards, principles, and methodologies designed for responding for the challenges that the cultural heritage is facing in territories of large scale and active military operations. And we are obliged to use the acquired experience, no matter it was a positive case or some negative case, and we have some losses make some mistakes and have losses. It is very important to update and develop the system for responding to threats and losses of cultural values. And unfortunately, the international system of cultural heritage protection has shown us its inadequacy. The international system of cultural heritage protection doesn't protect from missiles attacks. This system doesn't protect people and their heritage. And that's why I think this time to find out something new, new tools, new forms, new methods to cultural heritage protection. Because as it was stated by former UNESCO's General Director, Mr. Ahmadou Makhtar Mbow, he said that one of the most notable incarnation of people's genius, it's cultural heritage. And that is why we need to protect cultural heritage. And maybe
Thank you, Elmira. Thank you, Elmira.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Maria, over to you, 1 minute too.
Yes, thank you. I would like to recall that today in the morning, our office hosted the meeting of the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, with the members of the Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people. And the head of the Majlis, Rafat Chubarov, he used such a very powerful parallel. He recalled that today in the morning, Kyiv faced another rocket attack at 5 a.m. And it was at 5 a.m. 79 years ago when the deportation of the Crimean Tatar started. So, and the roots of this evil is just the same. And this evil was not punished back then. And that's why we are dealing with the situation now again. So, and this event was really important in emphasizing that there can be no compromises on Crimea. And I would like to really emphasize this idea, because oftentimes we can hear this, attempts, to make Ukraine think about some compromises. And I think that it's important connection between our today's topic and the current situation in the front line and in general is the fact that any compromises on Crimea could come on a price of elimination of Crimean Tatar people and of Ukrainians in Crimea, and elimination of the identity. Therefore, the best way to protect Crimean Tatars, the cultural heritage, Ukrainians, etc., in Crimea is to provide Ukraine with the proper weapons to give us a possibility to deoccupy Crimean Peninsula and to reintegrate it to Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katerina.
Thank you. Totally agree with my colleagues about the deoccupation and the need of weapons for it. In the judicial domain, I will just add that it is important that despite all the grave crimes that we are witnessing from across Ukraine, torture, enforced disappearances, deportation, to not forget to adjudicate the crimes affecting cultural heritage, exactly because they show the way Russia is trying to impose its persecutorial and allegedly genocidal policies. The states should also more proactively prosecute and adjudicate Russia's crimes, including those affecting cultural heritage, in their domestic courts, pursuant to the principle of universal jurisdiction. And finally, there is an ample evidence that Russian top cultural figures, the director of the Hermitage Museums, top members of the Russian Academy of Sciences, do recognize the occupation of Crimea, and they do research and publish research based on the objects to which they did not have the legal right to get access to. So the United States, as well as Ukraine's partners across the globe, should do a really good due diligence in terms of not associating with these partners, not allowing joint cultural events, and not allowing any special museum occasions with such partners as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katerina. Alim, your 30 seconds, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Violations of human rights is possible only because Crimea is occupied. And first of all, it's important to help Ukraine to restore civilian infrastructure and cultural heritage, support the preservation of Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar identities. And this is our common war. It's an anti-colonial war, an existential war for freedom, democracy, and for the supremacy of a human right. And we're confident in our victory. And but today, it's our common war, not only the war of Ukrainians. That's why please be with us and stand with Ukraine and support our country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alim. And for closing remarks, I will turn to Katerina Smagli, First Secretary, Embassy of Ukraine in the USA.
Thank you very much, SIPA, and thank you very much all the speakers for participating in today's excellent discussion. We have touched upon a number of very important and deep issues. Putin has started this war with a genocidal intent. There is no doubt about it. And it is our duty to prove him wrong. Ukraine's armed forces are proving him wrong on the battlefield. We as scholars, as experts, also have a duty to prove him wrong in university classrooms, in think tank discussions, in think tank programs and auditorium. This war has demonstrated lack of deep expertise in Ukraine, and now a lot of universities all over the United States and the world open Ukraine programs to study and understand Ukraine better. I can only urge them to open not only Ukrainian programs, but Crimean Tatar programs and the programs on Crimea, because this will also be used as an element for the occupation of Crimea and of our political efforts to advocate to keep Russia and its leadership accountable for all the crimes of aggression and crimes against humanity that they have committed in Crimea and in Ukraine. Thank you all very much for doing this wonderful, deep, thoughtful debate. Many thanks to our excellent moderator. And we hope that together with SIPA, we will continue working on the issue of protection of Ukraine's and Crimean Tatar cultural heritage.
Thank you so much, Katerina. Thank you all our wonderful and brilliant experts today for such a deep conversation. And thank you all for tuning into the discussion hosted by the Center for European Policy Analysis and the Embassy of Ukraine to the United States. For more research and analysis, please visit sipa.org or follow SIPA on Twitter. Thank you so much.